So as I write this paper, the topic of labor is ever present and it is often tense. In today's supposedly post-industrial climate, global markets estrange consumers from laborers, and the realities of production and exchange behind the things we consume remain relatively unknown. So today I want to question how examining textiles and the artists who manipulate them might offer insight into some of these current discourses surrounding labor. My presentation today is adapted from my recent graduate thesis, which addressed the critical connections between labor, capital, and textiles in relation to the artworks by American artist Anne Hamilton and Ghanaian artist Ibrahim Mahama. More specifically, my research argued that their installations, Hamilton's Indigo Blue and Mahama's Occupation series, pictured here, both harness textiles to unearth the histories of labor behind major industries in the artist's home country. Cotton and indigo production in America South, and jute production in Ghana, respectively. Originally commissioned for the Spoleto Festival USA in Charleston, South Carolina in 1991, Hamilton's Indigo Blue contains over 6,000 kilograms of blue-collar clothing stacked into a colossal pile. The blue clothing can be linked to two of colonial South Carolina's prominent crops, indigo and cotton, both of which relied on slave labor throughout the 18th century. The blue-collar uniforms are also a marker of the anonymous working class, and so Hamilton reintroduces the presence of workers and the necessity of manual labor industries, past and present. And every element of Hamilton's artwork, I argue, every piece of blue clothing, references moving, working bodies. The workers, enslaved or otherwise, who cultivated the cotton and indigo centuries ago, the blue-collar workers who once inhabited the uniforms, and the artists and staff who installed the artwork, folding and piling each item. Like Hamilton, Mahama utilizes cloth in his large-scale installations to poignantly reflect on notions of labor and commerce. In his ongoing Occupation series, the artist reconfigures old jute sacks into vast quilt-like structures, which are then draped across various public spaces and buildings worldwide. Jute itself is embedded in colonial histories, and today jute sacks are widely used across Ghanaian markets to package and export agricultural and mineral commodities, cocoa, rice, grain, coal, and others. The artist obtains these bags in their final stages of life, when the once sturdy material has become too tired from transporting heavy charcoal to remain functional, and with the help of his collaborators, local workers whom the artist employs for each project, Mahama transforms the jute sacks into art. Often, trinkets, tags, netting, and other materials are sewn into the fabric, evidence of how these bags were originally made, identified, and exchanged. Jute fabric even retains its trademark branding, product of Ghana, and other dates and signifiers indicating past encounters with various industries and workers. So while Hamilton and Mahama's artworks are made over 20 years apart, and they differ significantly in their historical and geographical contexts, I believe they each offer unique ways of thinking through the diverse histories of individual and collective labor that are embedded in the objects and the textiles that we use daily. And today, I will trace the local and global trajectories of cotton and jute to reveal how labor is embedded in each stage of the textiles' lives and Hamilton and Mahama's artworks as a whole. Furthermore, I believe that analyzing these artworks within the socioeconomic context of textile production offer valuable insight into the precarious and globalized nature of labor that constitutes our 21st century. So cotton and jute, the textiles featured in Hamilton and Mahama's respective installations, have spread to the far corners of the earth since their industrialization, each of their histories linking labor and cloth with commerce and empire. During the 18th century, ongoing international competition with India pushed Britain to develop new and speedier machinery for weaving and spinning, which birthed cotton manufacturing and led to the Industrial Revolution. Over the next 2 centuries, textile technology spread to the rest of the world, establishing a global cotton network that crossed borders and reformed modes of commerce and consumption. Likewise, in the 19th century, Britain and colonial India were world leaders in the manufacturing of jute goods, whose global presence was maintained through the international trade routes established by the British Empire. Today, the production of jute is concentrated to a few countries in Asia and Latin America, but is then distributed and used worldwide as a packaging material. The mechanization of textiles, combined with the realities of global capitalism and international trade, as exemplified through cotton and jute, have not only affected the products, but the labor behind them. From spindle to mill to plantation to factory, textile production, particularly clothing production, has been shaped by changing socioeconomic conditions, and thus reveals valuable information about labor and our shift from the local to global. Today, the global apparel industry is largely centered on the mass production and circulation of identical garments, often produced by underpaid workers in sweatshops at the lowest cost possible. Apparel sweatshops were once sites of activism for workers' rights and labor's politics during the 20th century, but in spite of these important victories in the West, the sweatshop survived in innumerable global contexts. In 1961, for example, only 4% of clothing bought in the United States were overseas imports made by overseas workers, but in the 2000s, this number rose to 90%. This statistic is important because it points to the increasingly globalized nature of the American economy through the lens of textile production. As textile industries move further away from local soil, the realities behind the production and production of the things we use daily become cloudier and more unknown. In 1995, a human rights group in Honduras came across dozens of Bangladesh workers in a garment factory, overworked and underpaid, sewing shirts for multinational retailer Walmart, where hundreds of millions of Americans shop annually. And in 2012, a fatal and preventable fire broke out in a garment warehouse in Dhaka in Bangladesh, claiming the lives of hundreds of workers who were producing clothes for Walmart and other American companies. And I make note of these events to highlight the textile workers made invisible under capitalist markets, but also to suggest that though consumers are estranged from these realities of textile production, we sustain the demand for disposable clothing, and therefore we contribute to their exploitation. In Hamilton and Mahama's installations, cotton and jute, two widely consumed textile products, are at the forefront, their presence familiar, but their origins less so, bearing only the occasional indicator like a generic word or a name stitched onto cotton, or a product of Ghana stamped onto the jute. Hamilton and Mahama's cloth do not immediately disclose the specific circumstances behind their production. The artist's use of these materials thus prompts a larger and more serious question. Do you know the story behind the textiles that you consume? While Hamilton and Mahama's artworks may not necessarily provide answers, they activate a line of questioning that encourages us to consider where the goods we use come from and who made them, and in turn revealing that there is a profound disconnect between those who buy mass-produced textiles versus those who make them. First exhibited in Charleston, South Carolina, Hamilton's Indigo Blue encompasses histories of indigo, cotton, and denim production in the United States. Cotton and indigo were cultivated in America's South beginning in the 18th century, when a seemingly limitless supply of land, slave labor, transatlantic trade networks, and a relentless hunger for indigo and cotton products in Europe allowed these commercial crops to flourish. While indigo cultivation eventually declined in America in the late 1700s and became largely ultimately replaced by an artificial blue dye, cotton production carried on through human labor and became a largely mechanized process in the West by the late 19th century. Woven by steam-powered looms in factories across the United States, robust cotton fabrics like the blue jean became linked to the industrial working class that made and wore them. And with this very brief history in mind, the giant pile of blue cotton clothing in Hamilton's Indigo Blue materializes this history of cotton production in the United States, from plantation slavery to industrialization to today's global manufacturing. Indigo blue also not only speaks to how past and present workers have shaped their country through their labor, but also speaks to how local textile sectors today are changing or being replaced altogether. In 2017, International Textile Group Incorporated announced the closure of the Cone Mills White Oak plant in Greensboro, North Carolina, the last major manufacturer of raw denim in the United States. With 200 employees laid off accordingly, the company's closure reflects a distinct shift from local to global textile manufacturing, and consequently, American denim companies must now turn overseas to source their denim. The White Oak's closure also comes at a particularly tense moment when jobs and American labor are regular topics of public discussion, with President Trump and the Republican Party promising growth in local manufacturing while demonstrating a particular animosity towards foreign laborers. The blue cotton or denim uniforms used in Hamilton's artwork reinforce this notion of a diminishing labor force, having once been worn by the laid-off workers or sourced from companies that have gone out of business. Stacked one on top of the other, thousands of blue shirts and pants, remnants of the unemployed, form a towering mound, a visual manifestation of jobs lost and laborers come and gone. And yet, while these blue-collar uniforms allude to the anonymous or the unemployed worker, in some instances, embroidered names adorn the clothing, like Oswaldo, Margaret, Kenneth, Mike, and others, providing small markers of identification to otherwise nameless workers. And I mention this small detail of Hamilton's work to suggest that though cloth's fast-paced, mass-produced origins are important in understanding the realities of globalized labor and production today, they do not necessarily constitute the end of the story, for cloth is eventually worn and it is used, and it is an intimate part of our everyday lives. As was the case with Hamilton's clothing, the jute used in Mahama's installations also retains moments of contact between people and places. Unlike Hamilton, however, Mahama's cloth is not used as is. Rather, it undergoes multiple stages of transformation from its initial beginnings as a packaging material to its eventual repurposing in art. Jute crops grow in tropical and subtropical regions, and they require ample labor to plow, sow, weed, cut, strip, and extract the desired fiber from the plant. Raw jute is then sold by farmers to merchants who transfer the product in bulk to a secondary center where it is treated and spun by machines into yarn. The yarn is woven into a heavy-grade fabric and finally sewn into sacks, which are then branded, bundled, and exported worldwide, and in the case of West Africa, used as a packaging material for mineral and agricultural commodities. In West Africa, jute sacks undergo many multifunctional uses across different economies and everyday life. First, jute is used to transport food products, such as coffee, rice, and cocoa, from West Africa to Europe and the Americas. The sacks are used only once to move cocoa beans, one of West Africa's most valuable exports, across international borders, then reused to transport other domestic crops locally. After being utilized in the food markets, jute sacks are repurposed by Ghana's mining industries to transport coal. And at this point, after the jute sacks have been used by various industries, broken down by their travels, and deemed too worn for further commercial use, Mahama acquires them through trade. And once in Mahama's possession, jute undergoes another series of transformations by even more working bodies. Mahama's installations first begin with an intentional unmaking. The collected jute sacks are disassembled stitch by stitch into separate pieces, then joined together like a quilt into enormous combined panels. Mahama employs local workers for each project who work together in communal settings, often the former sites of production themselves, like abandoned factories, train stations, markets, or courtyards. For Documented 14 in 2017, for example, Mahama and his collaborators occupied an old hen shell factory in Kassel, Germany, one of the first locomotive factories in Europe to produce the jute panels for his installation titled Checkpoints Kondilo. Unstitching and restitching the jute panels, Mahama's collaborators transform individual sacks into a collective whole, and often porous fabric preserves the sand particles, the sweat, and the evidence of one setting or maker and transfers them to another, and even picks up more traces anew. From its initial production to its global circulation and its eventual incorporation into art, jute is a product of laboring bodies and a repository for meaningful human traces. Like Hamilton's site-specific installations, Mahama's artworks respond to unique histories of labor embedded into the sites in question. At the Venice Biennial in 2015, Mahama covered a 300-meter-long corridor with 3,000 kilograms of jute fabric for his installation out of bounds. The artwork's location in the Venice Arsenal is noteworthy, for it was once a great working hub, employing over 2,000 workers per day, and one of the largest industrial enterprises in European history before the Industrial Revolution. Covering the very walls of the factories that once made cloth, rope, and other materials centuries before, Mahama's artwork, a product of intense labor itself, seems to awaken the industrial labor once inherent to the site. For another installation titled Coal Market in 2018, Mahama draped his charcoal-stained jute panels across a Baroque castle in Heron in Germany. The artwork's title not only references the Ghanaian coal industry in which his jute fabric is associated, but also ties to the history of the Ruhr region where the artwork was exhibited, whose declining coal industry shaped its economy for centuries. Through the use of jute fabric, I argue, Mahama bridges histories of labor continents apart. My goal today was to present Hamilton and Mahama's artworks and these legacies of cotton and jute as a critical means to survey textiles and labor. But also, I wanted to show that as textile production has changed over the centuries, that the labor behind them has changed too. And today, labor sectors are still changing, and these have palpable consequences at a local level. And so in light of these realities, I believe that contemporary artists like Hamilton and Mahama may play an important role in interrogating the precarious and dislocated labor that is our global economy, but also in unearthing meaningful histories of labor through their textile art. Thank you.